Hi everyone. So I did mess up just a little bit. So I'm actually recording this little bit that you're seeing right now before the main part of the video that I've put together. Gonna be super quick. So what happened was, as I was literally just finished editing the video I was gonna put up, I discovered that people did actually send messages for me. I'm clearly a absolute novice when it comes to Instagram. I thought they came through as messages, but apparently when you put together a question, they come out in the create section of a story, but that's anything. So I've got some questions that I've got here. Now, if they get answered in the video ahead, I'm just gonna leave them. But if I don't actually cover them, I'll quickly answer them here before we get into the video that I recorded previously. Best aircraft to do your float endo on, or even just some water landings for beginners. Well, best aircraft to do your float endorsement on. I wouldn't do it on a twin otter. Anything that's simple. Keep it simple, because landing on water and the takeoffs and all the water work that you actually do, completely different to what you would have done on the land. So the more familiar you are with a machine, the easier it's going to make that transition into floats. So if you learn on a 172, swapping across to something like a 206, a lot easier, because Cessnas, they're all somewhat similar. So it just making it easier on yourself, but to a certain extent, you don't really get a choice in the industry as to which ones you do it on. Question: is it harder to land on water than it is on the ground? Oh, it's a hard question, because a lot of people would say yes. Me personally, it's easier for me now to land on the water, because I have a lot more water time than I do land time now. So I prefer, and I find it easier to land on water. It's a completely different type of landing style. So normally you're taught when you're flying, say a 172 or a 150, instructors might attack my comment section here, I'm not too sure. But you're taught that when you're coming in, you kind of get over the runway, cut the power, and you kind of just sit it there and you stall it onto the runway. Very different to float plane flying. In float plane flying, that's the water, that's the plane, kind of come down. You set an attitude, because attitudes are very important. And then you use your power to adjust your rate of descent down into the water. So it's a very different technique than what you do find with land planes. All right, the next question was, should I do my rating in Oz or go to Alaska and convert my CASA license? If you really intend on going to floats and you're going to do it in, say, Alaska, FAA for the USA, or go to Canada, which I believe is the CEA, please correct me if I'm wrong. If your intentions is to fly float planes there, absolutely. It will be a big financial outlay, as you've got to convert your license and you've got to still go through the same processes, which I'll talk about in the video to come. But it's definitely an option. Lots of people do it. I never thought about it, not because I thought it was a bad option. Definitely a good option if that's a path you want to do, and there's some incredible flying over there, which I do talk about in the video up ahead. That's all the questions I got, and or at least the serious ones. Yeah, the serious ones I got. So without further ado, the video I actually filmed before I realized that I'm a novice with Instagram. Hi everyone. So you guys requested it. I'm going to do the seaplane industry. So didn't end up getting any questions from you guys, but I do have the frequently asked questions, dare I say, that I get a lot of people asking me when they find out I'm a seaplane pilot. So without further ado, let's dive into it. Now, seaplane flying, very interesting. A lot of people have wanted to try it, wanted to get into the industry, however it may be. First things first, there's definitely two avenues. First one is if you want to be a private seaplane pilot, or if you want to go down the path of being a commercial seaplane or float plane pilot. Sorry, I should say, I'm going to swap between seaplane and float plane. It's just in my vocabulary. To me, they mean the same thing. Anyway, I'm just pre-warning you that I jump between the two. Anyway, so yeah, there's a private way that you can go about flying seaplanes or float planes. And of course, there's the commercial side of going about flying seaplanes and float planes. Now I'm saying both. So let's dive in really quickly into the private side of flying seaplanes. I'm not that familiar about it, but I can definitely show you at least some idea of how you would go about getting a private seaplane. So, first things first, you've got to have a private pilot's license. I'm not too sure under the regulations if you can do it off an RPL. I would assume so under the new Part 61. This is for Australia, for anyone that's watching overseas. With Part 61, I'm pretty sure with an RPL you'd be able to get your float plane rating. Not too sure on that, but you definitely, I'll just say you'll need a PPL, a private pilot's license. So once you've got that, you can then go and go get your rating. So the first thing I did when I was going about finding out about the float plane ratings was the Australian Seaplane Pilots Association. Just got really confused there. So I'm just going to go straight on here. It's got seaplanes.org.au, which is the Seaplane Pilots Association of Australia. I'm a member of it. And it comes up with the page, and up the top with the categories, you've got a training, and it's literally got a list of all the training providers. I'll go through some of the commercial operators a little bit later on, but you can go here, and it's got a lot of the ones that are out there, some of the ones that aren't out there. Sometimes it's just a person that's got training approval, they're not a company, and you can get like the floating hull endorsement, which is different to your normal float plane. So just quickly covering that. Essentially planes that look like boats and they land on the belly, and the belly is like a boat. So you're talking your Mallards, your Sea Sprays, I think they are, or something like that, that pushes, your Icon A5, the one that's really popular at the moment. They're all floating hulls. So that is a different endorsement to say a float plane, which is where you get a conventional aircraft, take it off wheels and put two canoes on it, and away you go. So you got floating hull, you got float plane, two different things. So like going along, it's got a few operators there, websites, names, chief pilots, phone numbers, etc., etc. The one thing I will give you heads up with, very out of date. It's got some places, like the one I'm looking at here, won't read it. The company's almost not alive anymore, and they definitely don't have the aircraft that they've got listed there. So just putting it there that it's very helpful, but at the same time, it's not that accurate in the current world today. But as I said, I'm going to go through some that aren't even on these lists that will just give you a better idea of some options that are out there, especially if you want to go down the commercial path. So Seaplane Pilots Association of Australia, really awesome website. Even if you're just interested, I can't remember how much the membership is, but you get a lanyard. They've always got the Catalina Festival up in Rathmines in New South Wales on the Central Coast. Haven't been to it, really want to go to it. It's kind of like a seaplane fly-in. They normally try and get Black Cat, which is down in Wollongong at Haas, to come up, and they used to do like splash and goes, which is a seaplane term for touch and goes, but we do splash and goes. But from what I've heard, they can't do that anymore, but they normally still come and fly by. So really interesting. Last year, a friend of mine, Dan Bolton, who's also on Instagram as That Mallard Guy, they actually flew one of the Mallards down from Darwin, which would have been awesome to be there or even be a part of that. So if you're interested, they've also got some cool galleries, cool newsletters, stuff. Anyway, that's just one thing that I wanted to cover over with the seaplanes. Alrighty, so once you've found out, still on private here, once you've found someone that's going to give you a float rating, you can get your float plane endorsement or your floating hull endorsement, and you're good to, I guess in CASA's eyes or Recreational Aviation Australia's eyes, you're good to go. You can go fly a plane that lands on the water in whatever aspect it is, and no problems. You're good. You're legal. You've got it on your license, ready to go. Here comes to our next problem: insurance. Insurance, in particular, I actually, to be quite honest, I know nothing about private insurance when it comes to float planes and floating hulls, but in the commercial side, which I'll cover over a little bit later on, very strict. It's very hard to get into the float plane industry, pure and simply because they ask for a lot of experience. Nowhere to get those experience. So I'm not 100% sure what it's like in the private sector, but I guess you can completely boycott that whole insurance problem if you've got money, because you can just go buy your own float plane or floating hull And if you've got enough money to spend it on that, I guess you've got enough money to spend it on really good insurance. So that's the private sector. You can do private seaplane flying. I will put it out there right now, near on impossible to hire a float plane in Australia as a private pilot. Okay, so if you're going to go down the avenue of get your float plane rating because it sounds cool, if you've got money and you're happy to spend it, go for it. If you're doing it and really wanting to just do private seaplane flying, please don't. There's nowhere in Australia. I've tried to find, when I was still learning and still trying to get into the industry, trying to find someone that had a private seaplane to try and hire it. If they do have a seaplane and it's private, they'll almost never put you on the insurance. So there's your problem. That's what I'm saying. Insurance is a major problem in this industry just because of some of the accidents we have had. And also, going back, difficulty of finding people that actually do have a private seaplane, very, very difficult. Okay, so that's kind of, want to wrap the private sector up because as I said, I'm really not over the private sector as much as I am with the commercial sector of the float plane industry. So we'll move on. All right, so you've got your private pilot's license, you've done all your commercial training, and you're really eager to get into the seaplane industry. Congratulations. First things first, you have probably selected the hardest aviation industry, or I should say branch within the aviation industry to get into in Australia. The way of looking at it, I haven't actually done the maths like properly, but if you were to look at how many float plane pilots there were in Australia, some of the companies I've worked at, there's been 3 or 4 of us. The company I last worked for in Australia at the peak season, they had 10. Up in Darwin, Dan, correct me, I think you probably have about 6, 7. So in total within all of Australia, I would not see there being any more than probably 40 to 50 commercial rated seaplane pilots that have the necessary experience to be able to tick the box for the insurance. So it's very, very difficult. And there's a saying actually with the Paspaley Aviation up in Darwin that fly the Mallards with the turbine retrofit, that you have to wait until someone dies to leave the company to then be able to have your opportunity to get in. So very difficult, but that's just a saying that they've got up there that I've heard some people say. So is it impossible to get in? No, it's not. You've just got to be, one of my favorite words, I have it on my ring that I wear all the time, not now at the moment though, is persistence. If you want to get into the industry, you've just got to persist. You've got to be nagging all the time and find the right connections, which I'll get to a little bit later on. All right, so you've got your commercial pilot's license and you're dead set that you want to get into the float plane industry. Now, that is the biggest mentality that you have to have. I've seen so many people in the aviation, or I should say the seaplane industry, not make it or trying to get into the seaplane industry. And if you don't have the mentality that all you want to do is fly seaplanes, most companies are going to find that, and the seaplane pilots themselves are going to be able to find that. If you see float planes as a stepping stone to, say, the airlines, in Australia, don't know what it's like overseas or internationally. In Australia, unfortunately, you're probably going to get sussed out pretty quickly. The float plane industry in Australia is very tight-knit. Everyone knows everyone, and most of the time, when you pretty much get into the industry, you're, to a certain point, not saying you're shackled to it, but you're there for a very, very long time. It's most definitely not a stepping stone, as a lot of people, young pilots, will go out and find a GA job doing charter. You move on to the next job flying twins, then you move on to IFR flying night, etc., until you get to your jet job. Float planes, very different. A lot of people do not see it as the stepping stone to progression. Most float plane pilots have wanted to be float plane pilots for a long, long time, and they work super hard and have that persistence to get to the float plane industry. And when they get there, they're happy. Whether it be flying a little 206, a Beaver, a Caravan, or a Twin Otter, it doesn't matter. You find that a lot of us just love being on the water. For me, I did a lot of sailing when I was young, so I've just combined my desire to fly with my love of sailing, get float planes. So it's very in the blood float plane flying. I just can't reiterate that enough. It's not a stepping stone, especially in Australia, the industry. Um, that whole mentality of a stepping stone will get flushed out pretty quickly if you were to go for an interview or a check flight. Alrighty, so you're dead set on wanting to be a float plane pilot in Australia. How do you go about it? Well, as we mentioned, the same in the private pilots section, you've got to get a float plane rating. Now, I've written down a list of some of the operators that are commercial and some of their prices if they did them, just so you can get a rough idea of what's going about. A lot of seaplane pilots used to go through Port Macquarie seaplanes. I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty certain they're not operating anymore. The really good thing about Port Macquarie seaplanes was you did your float plane endorsement, and normally the owner would actually allow you to do a little bit of ICAS, whether that be flying the plane from the house where they based it at on a canal to the dock where they actually did the scenic flights. So that was really good. You definitely got an opportunity to just start building up those hours, which we'll come to, once again, reiterating, insurance, major problem in this industry. Sydney Seaplanes, they used to have a side brand called Sydney Seaplanes Global. Couldn't find the website, must have taken it down, and from what I've heard in the industry, their 206 is now gone. They've sold it. So, I don't really know what's going on there with Sydney Seaplanes at the moment with regards to their training. Do they do float plane endorsements? I'm not too sure. But while we're on it, that's where I did my float plane endorsement at Sydney Seaplanes Global, which was their training portion of the company. They had a really nice 206, which had a G1000. Incredible experience, because up until that time, all my commercial flying, all my IFR flying, which I had ticked off at that point, hadn't flown any glass cockpit. So it was actually nice to get into a G1000, have a little play around. Wasn't for that long, which gave me good exposure to that G1000. It was also amphib, which is really good because you also get your floater lighting gear. So you get your float plane endorsement, but you probably want to get your floater lighting gear as well, which means it's amphibious. So it's got the gear built into the floats. I also, when I went down to Sydney, I went down for a week and a bit. I did about 4 or 5 days doing the basic float plane training, which gives you your float plane tick in your license. Then I also did a couple of hours on a Beaver just to get those. I think I did like 4 or 5 just to get those into my logbook, because at that time I was actually frantically chasing a job up in the Whitsundays flying a Beaver on floats. Sydney Seaplanes, I loved it. The most important thing I loved about Sydney Seaplanes was it is a commercial operation. You're being taught by commercial pilots that are actually flying at Sydney Seaplanes, and they're giving you commercial experience. So it's not, this is what you do if you go on the weekend to fly. It was very commercialized. Essentially they're saying, you want to be a commercial float plane pilot, we're going to teach you to be a commercial float plane pilot. We're not going to teach you to a lower standard. That's where they set the bar. I really enjoyed Sydney Seaplanes. At the time though, it was also the most expensive seaplane training that you could do in Australia. But later on in what we're talking about, I want to explain to you that has paid off 10 times over, without a doubt. Next one on my list is actually one of my close friends. Saltair is owned by Adam Holt, a really incredible instructor. He was actually the one through Sydney Seaplanes that I did my float plane rating. He now owns his own company called Saltair, which does training, checking, stuff like that. He's still got it. I should have actually called him and checked to see if he does it. Adam, you can call me up and have an angry phone call with me. He still says it's about 6,600. I don't know if he can still find a float plane. He might be able to do it through Sydney Seaplanes on one of the Beavers. Not too sure. But if he still does them, Adam, if you still do them, everyone else that's watching, if you want to get a seaplane rating commercially, could not recommend Saltair and Adam Holt more. Incredible training, and it'll definitely prepare you for flying commercially if you definitely go down that path. Not being biased at all, we got Sea Wings Sydney, which I also believe is now called Sydney by Seaplanes. They're another operator down in Sydney. They've only got a Beaver though, and it's Steve Krug. Really nice guy. I met him twice when I was working down in Sydney. He still does float plane endorsements. He's got a quoted rough guide $9,000 to $11,000 to do your float plane training. That's boosted up a lot. Some of the other prices, which I've got written down, are a lot lower than that. He does it in the de Havilland Beaver. De Havilland Beaver is a lot more expensive. They're quite old, all made in the 1950s. Still kicking today like absolute weapons, but because they're so old and their parts are so hard to come by, very expensive to operate. Next one down, Eastern Air Services, which is in Port Macquarie as well. They say they do float plane training. They've got all of the syllabus there as to what they're going to be teaching you. Don't have a price though. So you'll have to inquire there. Dare I say they may have probably taken over everything from Port Macquarie. I've also got a friend there. I should have asked him before. If they do, how much? Not too sure. We got Melbourne Seaplanes. They've got a 172 on floats down in Melbourne. They're offering a float plane endorsement for $4,250, so definitely on the budget side of things compared to some of the other people floating around. And last but not least, I've got South Coast Seaplanes, which is a little charter operation down in Moruya. And they also don't publish how much it costs, but they definitely do float plane endorsements. And I believe they've got 2 malls on floats, on straight floats. I saw one up close one day, very, very nifty little beautiful aircraft. And they also say on their website that you can get ICAS, which once again is super important, trying to boost those hours up. That's all I've got written down for commercial operators that are or that have training approval or say they offer training approval. There's probably still a lot of people out there privately which you can still get float plane ratings through. Once again, go back to that Seaplane Pilots Association of Australia. Got all those training contact details down in there. Alrighty, so now we've got our float plane rating. We're stoked, we're hooked, we love floats, we love landing on the water, all the challenges that come with it. How do I now get my first job? First things first, a lot of people think they're going to get their float plane rating and jump straight into a job. Can tell you, definitely not going to happen. You're going to have to do a lot of work not flying within the industry before you really get your chance to get your first job. Normally that involves what's called dockhand or some sort of hanger rat, whichever term you've got for essentially doing the crappy jobs within a company. The way I got it was through my training with Sydney Seaplanes. I got the contacts through the company to then go down to Sydney. I moved from Brisbane down to Sydney to do 9 months during the peak of summer as the dockhand. Now as a dockhand, you catch the planes, you refuel the planes, you help passengers on with their luggage, you help them strap in, you also check passengers in, all that type of stuff. We also handled calling all the restaurants. Sydney Seaplanes flies to a lot of restaurants, so you're calling them, making sure that we're all on the same page as to what's happening for that particular day. So I did that for 9 months, and I'd saved my pennies up when I was in Sydney Seaplanes, and every chance I got, I'd go and do an hour flight in the 206 just to boost that up. Did try to do a little bit of ICAS through Sydney Seaplanes. No, it's very hard to do it. They do put a lot of stipulations on it. But in the grand scheme of things, the experience you're getting through working on the dock at Sydney Seaplanes or wherever it might be, and the contacts that follow that, absolutely essential. Because those, as I mentioned previously, everyone knows everyone in the industry. So the pilots at Sydney would know the pilots in the Whitsunday, which would know the pilots in the Kimberley, which would know the pilots everywhere. And then also internationally. So very, very important that you get those contacts. Once you get those contacts, you can then start feeding them out. You ask your friends that you've now, your new developed friends or contacts, if they know if there's any float plane jobs going. So in this particular case, 9 months, as I said, 9 months down in Sydney, working on the dock, just getting a little bit more experience up. By the time I finished my 9 months in Sydney, had 16 hours on floats. Not a lot at all. Now, through working at Sydney Seaplanes, got the contacts through Sydney for a job up in Kununurra, in the very northern section of Western Australia in the Kimberley, flying a 206 on straight floats. Through those connections, got the job there. And did 2 seasons in Kununurra flying this little 206 on floats. Was absolutely incredible. Learnt so much. It was one of those things that so many people told me that when you get your float plane or rating, I should say, You then get your first job. That's where you really start learning how to fly floats. As you get put into situations that just you cannot put in a training scenario, it's just not possible. I'm talking about the one situation I'll give you. I was flying into this resort in the Kimberley, and it was right at the mouth of the river, which then had open ocean into the Indian Ocean. So I landed, the wind was coming straight in the mouth, and I came around, landed on the beach, got the passengers off, and the way the plane was sitting was essentially perpendicular to the wind. So it wasn't parallel, it wasn't sitting into the airflow of the wind. And when the plane's on the water, it's essentially just a big sailboat, or like any boat, it wants to sit into the wind. So as I pushed off, the plane instantly swung 90 degrees to the beach, and I'm trying to get the engine started. Engine starts, and then the wind was too strong, couldn't turn away from the mouth of the river, had to switch the engine off because the swell was getting too bad, and then I had to do what's called sailing, which is when you essentially turn the engine on and you float backwards and use the controls, the flight controls actually, to manipulate how the plane sits in the water to then float it back up the river and then take off. That was about 2 weeks after I got checked to line on my first job. And you learn a lot once you get your first job in the industry. So I did 2 seasons up there, so a total of 12 months with that company. From there, I then jumped across after the second season across to the Whitsundays to Hamilton Island, where I went over there to fly beavers on floats. Unfortunately, never actually eventuated me flying beavers on floats. I think out of the 6-ish months I was there, did about 4 hours on beavers. By that time, I'd had, I think, just shy of 500 hours on floats. Then, because I wasn't getting any float flying there, went across to Broome in the 2019 dry season to fly caravans, which was always my dream seaplane to get onto in Australia. Did that. Still to this day, the best job I've ever had, flying in Broome, the caravans on floats. Absolutely. It was amazing. I loved the people I was working with. The planes were absolutely immaculate. The company spent a lot of money on them, so we had new GPSs. One of them was G1000. It was just an all-round. I just loved it. It was an incredible operation. Then the end of the season happened there, and didn't have a job, so was looking around and got contacted by the Philippines, a company over there, and went over to the Philippines and was the senior pilot. I guess you'd call it a senior pilot because I was the only captain there. 2 first officers, 1 captain. 2 first officers interchanged. I just got used a lot. I flew a lot. And then come to present day coronavirus, or I should say COVID-19, where none of the seaplane operations are now currently operating. So it's pretty incredible once you get that foot in the door. That's why I was just rattling off what I've done. Once you get that foot in the door, you've made it into a club that's very exclusive. And once you start racking up those float hours, there's so many opportunities. I know that before COVID-19 really hit, Vietnam was really desperate for seaplane captains. The Maldives has been hiring up like crazy. There's now a second company that's just started up in the Maldives, which is hiring like crazy. So there's a lot of opportunities out there to do float flying. And of course, if you want to go into the more extreme stuff, there's some pretty wicked things you can do over in Canada. One of the guys I work with at Sydney Seaplanes, he got a job with Conair, which is one of the hugest firefighting companies in Canada, flying the air tractor, which is like, for those of you that don't know, it's like a crop duster with floats. And they go down, scoop the water up, and then go bomb the fire. And he came back for the most recent fires and was helping out there. So there's so many incredible opportunities that you can be exposed to in the seaplane world. It's just very, very difficult to get into it. Lastly, I just want to cover off, as I've mentioned multiple times now, the insurance. Because a lot of people complain, especially one article that was from about 3 years ago about Sydney Seaplane, or it wasn't that long, it was about 2 years ago, when they were talking about the visas, not just for pilots, but for everyone. And Sydney Seaplanes was saying that there's no Australian pilots that they can hire. Now, I'm not saying I agree with them or disagree, I just want to point out the insurance facts when it comes to this. To operate somewhere like Sydney Harbour, extremely difficult in the float world. There are so many boats. Sometimes the conditions are horrendous and the boats normally don't get out the way. So very challenging conditions. Imagine having 16 cars driving across the runway when you're coming into land. None of them are watching out for you, and you essentially have to judge the best time to then come in on the runway when they're not crossing over. That's flying floats in Sydney, very difficult. So the insurance requirements there, which I've been told multiple times, is at a bare minimum 1,000 hours in total time and 500 on float, which to a lot of people seems a lot of hours, but to me now, very deep into the industry, I almost think that's too little. Like, it is so difficult, and there's so many situations that you can get put into where even a 3,000 hour float plane pilot has never seen before, and it can be very tricky, and they have to grab all their experience, combine it together very quickly to make a decision and act on it. So float plane flying in the industry, incredibly rewarding, incredibly difficult to get into. You can experience some amazing things when you do get into it and get out there and get exposure to all these incredible places. I've been flying over 2 World Heritage listed sites, the Bungle Bungles, Great Barrier Reef, most recently in the Philippines, which is just incredible. And as I mentioned, my favorite place, Broome, and in general the Kimberley. I just love the Kimberley so much, which I just wouldn't have got if I went down, say, a cadetship path or the Air Force. So very grateful for the path that I've taken. It will take a lot of hard work if that's what you want to do. It's not going to be like any other industry within the aviation industry. But if you stick it out and you really, really want to get there, and it's not your stepping stone, you want to be a float plane pilot, guarantee you will get there. That's pretty much all I've got to say on the industry. If you do have any questions that you have for me, as I mentioned, I didn't get any after the Instagram story I put up. If you do have any further questions about the float plane industry, anything you'd like to know, any tips, advice, please just send me a message, whether it's through Instagram, Facebook, or through YouTube. I'll definitely respond to those. And I sincerely thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and stay tuned for the next video. I will be putting up something on Facebook and Instagram soon as to the next topic. I'll let you guys choose again. As mentioned, you guys chose this topic, Seaplane Industries. Won out over my record flight, overseas flying and gliding. So we'll see what you guys come up with next. Thank you and adios.